Okay, cool. Welcome, guys. So today we're going to be chatting a little bit about Flutter. This is going to be a part of a series. So we'll have a couple of different workshops all about Flutter. The goal of today is to just get you guys introduced to Flutter, Dart, the whole ecosystem, the bare basics of Flutter and what it does and what problems it solves, and how you can go about writing your first very small application. So at the end, we're going to get into a little bit of code where you guys will get to see the things that we've discussed. But the following workshops will be a lot more technical and a lot more code related. But yeah, feel free to ask questions at any point if you guys have. Cool. So what is Flutter? Flutter is an SDK, software development kit, built by Google, which can be used to build mobile, web, and desktop applications from a single code base. And Flutter makes use of a programming language called Dart. So Flutter initially was just mobile, just aiming to have one single code base that could, compile to Android and iOS. But since I think it came out like 2.5 years ago, I've been using it for like 18 months and I love it. But since then, they've introduced Flutter for web, desktop, and their Microsoft version is actually an alpha. So that will mean Flutter will be able to build Xbox applications and Windows applications, all of that type of stuff. So that's going to be really cool to see. Flutter takes pride in its ability to be expressive and perform on a native level. So if you're familiar with Ionic or React Native, while you can have really strong applications using those frameworks, they always have a JavaScript bridge. And that's kind of what holds them back in terms of performance and being able to control every pixel, because ultimately it's not native. There's a JavaScript bridge that is kind of handling everything there. But what Flutter does is it has a compiler which compiles its code to a native ARM machine using Dart's native compilers. So you'll actually have a full Android application and a full iOS application at the end of the day. Okay, so what is Dart, right? So now we're not using JavaScript, we're not using C# or Swift or Objective-C or anything like that. We're using Dart. So Dart markets itself as a client-optimized language for fast apps on any platform, and it was kind of built specifically for Flutter. So you're not going to see this in a bunch of other places. You're mostly just going to see this with Flutter. Dart is a type-safe language, and it makes use of static type checking or runtime checks. So it's not as loose as JavaScript can be, where you don't exactly know what you're working with sometimes. And Dart is incredibly simple to pick up if you have worked with C# or JavaScript before. So you guys could, if you have done a little bit of React or JavaScript or some C#, you will recognize a lot of things, because it kind of feels like they both got together and had a 21st century child in the fact that they are proper classes, there can be interfaces, but it still has the, I guess, the looseness and the freedom that JavaScript offers. And that's quite cool to have in one language. So why should you use personal? You've spoken to me about mobile apps. I always say go with Flutter, but I have built apps in Ionic Angular as well as Ionic React and in React Native. And in my personal opinion, nothing compares to Flutter in terms of performance, the development process, everything. So the development process with Flutter is far simpler and way less infuriating. We can have an app and we can have it deployed to a phone within 2 minutes. A lot of these other frameworks require you to have extra knowledge, or you have to use all these different things to get things up and running. Flutter is super intuitive. It also comes with a CLI, which I say there is very intuitive, and it doesn't require you to learn a fleet of NPM equivalent commands in order to get up and running, right? Because we're not in the node world anymore. We're not using NPM, and Flutter obviously has to have its own way of building and deploying and all that type of stuff, right? And the UI is always far more impressive and responsive. That might be my personal opinion, but Matt has been messing around with Flutter on one of our internal projects recently, and I'm sure he can attest because he also has React Native experience. But Flutter it's far smoother. It just feels better on your phone. It feels like a native app that was built in Kotlin or Objective-C. And then Flutter makes use of the hot reload functionality, which means that changes made to your code can be instantly viewed after saving a file. Which is kind of a standard these days, to be honest, with frameworks. No one wants to have to recompile their code and then run it every single time they change one line. But Flutter just does it yeah, nothing else compares to how consistent and stable its hot reload is. Okay, so how to create a Flutter project. So Flutter has an incredibly powerful CLI that you're required to start your Flutter journey. You can follow all the necessary steps here to get yourself set up. I'll give you guys the link to the slides. You can see it up top if you do want to follow along, but this will just take you to the install, and you can select what system you're on, and then you can install Flutter. Then all you'll need to do to create a new Flutter project would be run Flutter create workshop app. So that's obviously the Flutter command that's now sitting in the CLI, and that's being our terminal create. So we're saying we're going to create a new application and then our application name. Don't worry, after the slides, we are going to get into all the code stuff that we have covered in the slides. And what this will do, this will scaffold out a new application for you, which has a basic counter system. So it will just have start at 0, and you can press a button and you can increment that counter. And they'll have everything you need to basically get started. And right away, you could put it on your phone if you wanted to. It's that simple and it's that fast. So what is the Flutter ecosystem like? Obviously, it's new and it's fresh, you know, and it's not Node and stuff anymore. But it is very similar to Node, so you don't have to panic too much. So you might be thinking, how am I going to get packages and libraries built by other people? Must I build everything myself now if I want to do some form of state management, or if I want to have a toggle, or if there's some type of Google Maps implementation, do I have to build that myself? Absolutely not. There are a ton of people who have made this community really amazing, and they've gone and built packages and all that stuff for you. And the Flutter team themselves and Google, because obviously it's backed by Google, have developed quite a couple of packages that you can go and use, and it's maintained by Google themselves. So PubDev, what is PubDev? It's basically the NPM equivalent for Flutter, and it's a place for developers to build and share their Flutter and Dart projects and their libraries and their widgets. And the site is incredibly simple and easy to use. We're going to be using it later, but just to give you an idea, this is what it looks like. And we can see a whole bunch of different packages here. So if we look at, let's say, PDF. So this is a PDF creation library for Dart and Flutter. So, I mean, that's pretty powerful right off the bat. And then everything from installing it tells you exactly how to install it, the versions, all of that type of stuff. Very similar to how Node does things. Okay, so how can I add packages to my project, right? So we've seen this PDF package over here, and we go, okay, I actually do want to create a library, a PDF. How do we go about that? So first, you find the package you like. We've done that. Then we get the latest version number. So obviously everything is versions. So if we go to installing, we can see this over here is telling us that is the name of this package, and that is the latest version. So by default, if you click on the installing tab, it always has the latest version available to you. Obviously, you can check previous versions if you are wanting to go down or a big version of the package. Then you can add it to your pubspec.yaml file, and which is basically the equivalent of a package.json. So if you've used npm, you'll know exactly what that looks like. You throw it in there, and then you save that file, and then it will basically load that and bring in everything for you. It's equivalent of running an npm-i. And then you have access to that package within your whole application. Again, don't worry, we will go through this whole thing with an actual situation later on. So Flutter is composed of widgets, right? So Flutter themselves state that Flutter drew a lot of inspiration from React while they were creating it, and how React has components and a component tree and all of that. Flutter has widgets and a widget tree. I don't know why they chose to use the term widgets. It would have been simple if all these frameworks just had the same terminologies, but you know, everyone wants to be a snowflake. So widgets can be thought of as very similar to components in React, in the way that widgets describe how a view should look based on the state that is provided to that widget, right? So it's like the age-old function, the inputs, whatever you want the function to do, and the output. That's basically what a widget is. But widgets must implement and override a build function in order to determine what is being rendered. Okay, so you will see that later on. But yeah, you can't have a widget without a build function, else it's not going to render anything. It's not going to know what it needs to do. Okay, so what is a widget tree? If you're familiar with React, you'll kind of get this. But a tree basically describes the hierarchy of all the widgets that are within your application. So your main app will be at the top, and then you can have this view, and this view has an input or something like that. There's an example here, which is actually from some of the Flutter videos. So you can see how they're kind of describing it. They have the My App, and then they have various screens, the login screen, the catalog, the My Cart screen, and then how those are broken up into sub widgets. So it's just a big tree that goes all the way down. Then what is the element tree? Okay, so this is something that not a lot of Flutter people are aware of or know about, as it's happening in the background, but I think it's something quite useful to know. So an element tree is Flutter's widgets are used building an algorithm is sublinear. So this means that after the widgets are built, the element tree is actually responsible for holding the widgets in their place and containing that logical layout. The reason being is because widgets are immutable, which means that actually, as soon as they render, they forget where they are. They don't know who their parents are in the tree, and they don't know who their children are in the tree. So they're kind of stupid in that way. But the element tree is there to be responsible for informing each widget of where it fits in the tree and providing it with the actual state. And we can see here the element tree also holds the state objects that are associated with stateful widgets. Okay. So now we're speaking about stateful widgets, which means the different types of widgets. So the first one, we can look at the simpler one, in my opinion, are stateless widgets. So stateless widgets are widgets that do not require any mutable state, right? So they're pretty much just rendering something, and they're taking an input maybe and rendering it, but they're not trying to mutate that in any way. So they are used to describe the user interface. So they're often used to structure the UI or style the UI or define the layout, something like that. So Flutter has a lot of native widgets available to you, obviously. So if you think like how HTML has a H1 and a B tag, Flutter has the equivalence in terms of a padding widget or a contained widget or a scaffold widget. And we're going to see a little bit of those down the line. And another thing to note in a stateless widget is that everything is final, right? So everything is marked with a final keyword, obviously, because for the lifetime of that widget, the state should not be changing. It is stateless, and therefore it should not be changing in any way. So now if we discuss stateful widgets, okay, there's a bit more to stateful widgets, obviously. So they allow us to work with mutable states. And what stateful widgets do is they create a state object which has the data that can then be manipulated. So you'll notice how every stateful widget is a class, and it'll actually have then another class that is considered the state object. Okay, so the state object can be manipulated through the use of a method called setState. So as soon as they are extending upon the state class, which creates the state object, you're provided with a method called setState. So very similar to how React pre 16.8 was, right, where you were able to set state in that way. And once set state is used, Flutter will compare the new state with the previous state and re-render any changes to the UI that are required. Very similar to React, it's just going to compare the previous state with the new state and go, okay, only this part changed, so I only have to re-render these. When the state is changed, that widget will mark its clarity, and then when the next frame comes around, it will re-render the component with the new state. Another thing to note is that you might be thinking, if you've worked with state and stuff before, how do they maintain state between renders, right? Because when a re-render happens, everything should be lost. Flutter was quite smart in that approach, or Google was quite smart in that approach, because they designed stateful widgets have very long lifespan. So what happens if a re-render occurs higher up in the widget tree? So I've got a counter over here, and there's a parent above it, and that parent re-renders, surely the state here will be lost now, right? Because this has to re-render. But that is not correct, because Flutter holds the state of the new widget in the element tree. So the element tree, not the widget tree, actually holds that state. So while the widget re-renders, the element tree will then provide it with a state of the previously rendered widget, if that makes sense. I have a better example here. So if we think of, we have an attendee list. So if we have a workshop, all of you guys are the attendees, and we have an attendee list component, and then we have a whole bunch of attendee name components, right? So for each of you, we have a list, and we're going to iterate over that list and render out people's names. And then within each attendee name, we have a text widget that is going to show that person's name. So you can see here how we're passing down the name property Harley to this widget. Okay, and that's what it's going to render. So now if the attendee list were to re-render, and this is the whole widget tree, Harley will not be lost, because think of it like on the side here, the element tree is actually containing that state and passing it in to this attendee name widget. So it won't be lost between renders. Okay, that's kind of the briefest summary of quite a bit of Flutter stuff. Are there any questions on anything so far?
All good. All good.
Okay, makes sense to everyone. A lot of you guys have worked with React, so I feel like a lot of the terminology might be quite similar, or the concepts at least. Okay, so let's create an application. So obviously I have Flutter installed on my machine, and we can go ahead and create that Flutter workshop app we were speaking about earlier. So we run that command. It's going to do a whole bunch of stuff. We can see in our workshops folder over here, we have the workshop app folders that now there, and it's scaffolded out that whole solution. And when it's done, we'll open it up in VS Code. And there are a couple of things that you need to do when you get started with Flutter. So they have a command called Flutter Doctor. And if you run that, it's basically like a sense check, and it tells you, okay, you still need this, this, and this. So you can see here, it's checking my Android Studio, that I have that installed on my machine, and that I have accepted all the licenses. It's checking that I've got VS Code, because that is the IDE of choice for developing in Flutter. It's checking that I have a device connected, so I actually have an emulator running over here. And it's checking Xcode, that's for iOS, and it's checking my Android toolchain. So when you guys get Flutter for the first time, you can run Flutter Doctor, and it's going to say, okay, cool, you just need to do this, this, and this first before you can actually deploy, but it takes a couple of minutes. Again, super cool, super intuitive. You don't have to think too much. You don't have to Google too much. It kind of does everything for you. So now if we open up our open up a folder and workshop app, there we go. So now we can check out what they've scaffolded for us. So we can see we've got the pubspec.yaml. So that is what I was speaking about earlier, in being the equivalent of the package.json, basically. So you can see how it has a name there and a description, and it has all of these comments and stuff, just explaining certain things. We don't have to worry too much about that. You guys can always go through that on your own. This over here is our dependency. So just like in NPM, we have dependencies and development and dependencies. We've got the exact same thing here. So if we were to import a package, this is where we would throw it in. Okay, so we're gonna get to that. And if we check out lib, so you can see Android, iOS. You guys don't generally have to touch that unless there are a couple of versions that you're needing to manipulate. You should be fine. There might be some settings that we might have to change to get it running on Android. We'll see. But otherwise, we can check out the main application. So I want to remove all the comments so that you guys can just see code. Again, if you guys go and do this on your own, you'll be able to see all these comments and you can read through them. There might be quite extra information, but I have a specific, I don't know, routine I'm wanting to go through here. So let's just remove all of these. This might look quite foreign to you. Even if you've done React or something like that, like this is still going to look quite weird because of how this all fits together. So let's get the app running first. And to do that, so we have VS Code has this button over here, which is for running your applications. You'll see that we need to create a launch.json. So we just say create. It automatically figures out that we're using Flutter. And now we can see over here, we have this run. So let's try run this. And if it complains, it might be like the minimum SDK version or something like that isn't set up right, or we need to enable multi-dex. But yeah, let's see what happens. It might take a second because it is the first run.
Ollie, while that's running,
Yeah.
if you were to transplant a React developer into the Flutter world, how quickly, in your opinion, do you think they would catch up and be productive, given that they've got a reasonable amount of React experience?
Matt, do you want to answer that question?
Probably maybe just to be comfortable, like maybe a week or two, and then you should be there. Like obviously you still need to rely on the docs quite heavily, but to get up and going, I'd say maybe a week or two.
Okay.
So, yeah, so Matt started working late last week, and he's already about to make his first pull request with full UI implementation functionality behind it, calling off to a service, the view model, everything. Obviously, it will differ based on the person's, say, their general level and their experience with React, maybe. But the general concepts in terms of how state works and how a widget tree works and that type of stuff, you'll pick up pretty quickly. I think the toughest part is the actual building the UI is probably the part that people struggle with the most because of it's just a very foreign approach. But in terms of writing methods and stuff, like on your services, on your view models, that's very similar to JavaScript and C#. So I don't think that's where people would struggle too much.
Okay, cool.
Cool. So let's look at what this has defaulted out for us. So we can see we've got an app bar at the top here saying Flutter demo homepage. We've got some text over here, another text over there. And if we click this button, oops, sorry. Not working. That's interesting. There might be an issue on their latest build. Anyway, I want to go through how this is all structured together. So remember how I said a widget needs a build method? That is this over here. So we see that we have a stateful widget, right? So the my homepage is our widget, and it's a class, and it's extending stateful widget, okay? And it needs to then create its state objects. That is what this is doing over here. We're saying, okay, cool. We're going to create a new state object that is equivalent of, it's just general practice to use underscore for private stuff in Flutter, an underscore my homepage state. And then we are creating a state object out of the my homepage class over here, okay? And what that means is that this class over here has access to the set state method, so it can manipulate the value in this counter over here, okay? If we look all the way at the top, so now this is the top of our tree. This is kind of straightforward. We are, again, it is a state, this is a stateless widget because we don't have any data that we're trying to mutate here. Again, we are returning a widget. We are using overriding the build method. It takes in a build context. Not going to go too much into that, but that basically allows Flutter to know where everything is happening and how to string it together. And we're returning a material in Google, which is why it looks like Google, but there's also a whole bunch of Cupertino, which is the Apple equivalent side of things. So yeah, and then we're saying just the title of this, we're providing some theme data. The theme data is really cool because you can say, I want the default color to be blue. So every time you create something, the default color is going to be blue, which means you're not having a whole bunch of like magic strings all over the place where you're having to set certain things, right? And then we have the my home page, which is our home widget. So in a general application, you might have your splash or your login or something as your home page. And if we look over here, we're passing in a title to my home page, right? So just like in React, your classes and stuff are kind of like your components and your widgets are basically just methods. So we're saying, okay, this requires a title, so we're going to pass this title in. So if we look over here at my homepage, and remember how I said it's a stateful widget, but the title is not going to change. So the title we can say is final. We're going to accept the title and we're just going to render that. So if we were to change this to workshop app, we can see over there it changes right away. And that's also showing off the hot reload, right? So that's kind of the difference between stateless and stateful in application. Stateless, not mutating state, The class just exists on its own. It doesn't need any form of state object. But then when you actually have something that needs to be able to mutate state, like on my homepage, where it's needed to mutate this count, you first have to create the my homepage class, and then you actually need to create an instance of a state object for that class, which is what this whole class over here is. And then over here, we find the build, which is going to return everything out. So now if we look at what this looks like, every page has a scaffold. It's just the default widget that you use on a view, and the scaffold has a couple of properties to it. So just stop me if this is going too fast, if this doesn't make sense. But the scaffold can take in a couple of different things, and one of the things it can take in is an app bar. Okay, so app bar is obviously another type of widget, and the app bar can take in a couple of different things, and one of the things it can take in is a title, and that title needs to be we can make it a text, and we can say the widget.title that we passed in. So for interest's sake, if we were to take this out, you see how we lose the app bar at the top. It's that simple in essence to structure your application. So now we can say, okay, cool. What else can app bar take in? If we hover over this, we can see it can take in a background color. It can take in a text theme, the title, center title. So if we want to center the title, that's a Boolean. So we say true. There we go. And we can see now it's centered, and it's in the top of the screen. So you see how widgets are designed to be very customizable, and then they define the properties that can customize it, and then based on what you provide them, they'll associatively render that out for you. So if we were to say background color, and we have this, Flutter has this colors, kind of like an enum, and we can say we want this to be pink. We save that, we can see how now this is pink already. It's that fast, it's that amazing. And if we weren't passing in the title here, right? We don't have to pass in the title. We could just say Harley's Flutter app, and it would render that out. But maybe this example was just wanted to show you how you can go about passing stuff in. So let's mess around a little bit. I want to work off of what we have. So we're not going to make an app in this situation that makes 100% sense. Maybe let's leave that as it was. Just want to show you guys how we can go about styling things. So the text widget, the first thing that you provide is obviously the text that you want to show, but it has another property called style. And if we hover over this, we can see it needs to take in a text style widget, okay? So we pass it a text style widget, and then we look at what this has. So it has color, it has font size, it has weight, height, all of these different things, right? So if we just start messing around and we say height, so we can give it like 20 minutes weight. Oh, sorry, height. I meant font size, but I was saying height. Font size. There we go. Maybe a little bit bigger, say 40. Cool. And then we saw fonts weight. And they're similar to colors, font weight. And then we can see bold over there. So kind of like an enum again. And we can see how that's bold now. And we can say color. And we can say colors. We want this to be blue. We save that. So the hard part, to go back to your question, Guy, about Flutter, is really just knowing the ins and outs of these built-in native widgets that you have access to, and knowing when to do what, knowing how to put something in the center, how to space things out. So like if we wanted to space these out, right? We can see over here that we have a text widget without any styling on it, and it just says you pushed the button this many times. And then we have another text widget. Those are children to this column widget, okay? And this column widget doesn't just take a child, it takes multiple children. So whatever else we throw in here, it's going to render just underneath each other like that. But most often, the majority of widgets take in a single child. So if we look at center over here, center takes in one child widget. Okay, but what center is doing, if we were to remove that, what it was doing was centering this in the center of the page, and then taking in a child, which would be whatever else you want to do. So once you understand the hierarchy of widgets and what widgets should be the parents of one and what should be the child, you can very easily start creating some really cool UIs. So let's look at this. Like over here, so the icon for this fab, the floating action button, we can see that it's icons.add. Okay, so it's child for the floating action button. We tell it what to do when it's pressed. We give it a tooltip, and then we say the child is using icons.add, but we could say we want this to be icons plus 1. There we go. So now it's +1. And if you guys have an Android phone, you know in WhatsApp how it kind of looks like, it would look something like this. WhatsApp, and this would be like a green accent maybe. Yeah, sure, let's go with that. And on WhatsApp, it is not centered. It's to the left. If we just do that. Don't know why that's not taking. There we go. And then it has like the 3 hamburger dots on the side. So that's something else that an app bar takes in. So app bar takes in something called actions. And actions is an array that you can pass in. So we could tell this that we want to give it a flat button. So Flutter has a couple of native types of buttons. You have a rounded, and you have flat, and you have outline. Obviously, you know, flat means that there's no visuals around it to show you that it's a button. And we can say when we're on press, we don't have to worry about that for now. And the child must be an icon, and we're going to use the icons dot more. No, more horizontal. That work? Maybe it's more vertical. Sorry, I only recently moved to Android again after a couple of years. There, and that's kind of like very quickly. Obviously, there's no functionality, right? But like we've been able to build an app bar that looks very similar to how WhatsApp has theirs. Just going to stop here. Any further questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Yeah.
So when you're working traditionally with something from React, you're doing like say style components, you're wanting to kind of structure your app and reuse you know, at least colors and functionality. What's the sort of thing that you would what's best practice to do that in Flutter?
Cool. So yeah, that's a really good point. If you see over here, we have this theme data widget, okay, where we're saying like the primary, there are other things you can pass, a primary color. So generally we use a primary color, and we can say blue, and then a secondary color, or it's accent color, and we could say pink. And then what we would do is we would throw this into its own file, and then we would return that theme data widget file. So you'd have a method in that file which would return the theme data, and then that's what you would reference here. And then basically anywhere else where, like you say, you're wanting to reuse that style and make it consistent, you would import that particular method which will return you the theme data, and then you could go theme data dot primary color. So it's kind of like it creates an object for you with all of these properties that have your like styles, whether it be colors, whether it be the size of your headers, whatever. And then you just reference that. So that's like that's the I guess, the best practice of how to go about that currently in Flutter. But yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, cool.
Cool. So I want to show you guys how we can abstract stuff out, right? So if we look at say the app bar over here, if we were to extend this whole page, add a lot more functionality, you know, we're going to end up on a whole bunch of lines, and it's going to start looking quite confusing. So what Flutter does really well is it allows you to abstract things out. So if we say, okay, let's take this app bar, let's put it in its own little class, and then we can just reference that class here. So let's take this out, and down here, let's create a new class, and we'll call it, I don't know, my app bar, because the app bar is obviously already taken. And this is stateless, right? This isn't requiring any type of state that we have to mutate. And then we need to override the build method. So we return a widget. The method is called build. It takes in build context, and then we can return this. And now, like I said earlier, we don't actually need to pass this in here because that's not changing at any point. So we can call it workshop app, and we can leave our actions over there. We can do something like this. So that print is the biggest transition between JavaScript or React and Angular, Vue, and Flutter. The most common mistake I make is that I type console.log instead of print. So we can see over here that we have this debug console, right? And that's obviously showing us everything that's going on. So if we now make use of my app bar over here, why is that complaining? Why is that complaining? Preferred sized widget. Okay. So you can't actually abstract the app bar out because it thinks you're risking removing the potential sizing of this. That's quite interesting. I didn't know that. That's what I get for not testing this beforehand. Let's put the app bar back, my bad. And let's abstract these different texts out and see if that works. Okay, so we can call this counter body. And override build context, and we could actually take out this whole thing here. And now we need to return this. And then the counter, let's just set that to 0 for now. And then we can say counter body. Okay, cool. So now we know that that is working. If we make that 2, that'll be 2. Okay. So there we've abstracted the body and all of this extra stuff out. So you can see how if you have buttons or if you have multiple widgets on a single page, so you've got like images at the top, and then you've got a title and then a description and then user reviews. I'm just thinking Airbnb in my head here. You don't have to have all of that sitting on one, like within one class, but you also don't have to have them all sitting in one file. You could easily just throw this into its own file as like a sub widget that is a part of this overall widget, right? But now let's look at actually bringing in an actual package, because we discussed that earlier. So I found one I wanted to mess around with earlier called toggle bar. So what this allows us to do is just, it's this part over here. It's a little toggle at the top there. So we click on installing, and we copy this line over here, and we go to our pub spec. We don't need Cupertino icons. And then we save the file. You can see over there, it's running a Flutter pub get. So anytime you save this file, the CLI is actually running that for you, which, like I said, is the equivalent of the npm I. So now we have that available to us. So if we go check the README again, I just want to get this import over here. And now if we go to the top, just add that import in. So now we should have that available to us. It's not complaining, so it looks like we do. And let's maybe do this. Let's wrap counter body in a column. So we've now created a column. So we initially, if we just have the counter body, that's the only widget we can return, right? But we want to have another widget that's not necessarily related to the counter here. So if we turn that into a column and we have children, then we can make use of another widget. And we want to use something like this. Let's just copy what they have here, and we can throw that in. Do something here. Let's say print index for now. Okay, there we go. That quickly, we've already got this set up for us. And we can see now, so if I just want to check if it's printing. Sorry, I was syncing there for a second. Okay, it's not allowing me to, clicking on this, on the app is actually not triggering. I wonder if it's just, I just want to restart my emulator. That is the one problem with emulators, is that they're still janky after so many years. I just want to restart the emulator. Pixel. So yeah, the click wasn't working, and I want to show you guys how we can do some more cool state stuff. But if I can't click on my emulator, that's not going to help much, is it?
I guess I do have a question about that then.
Yeah.
So you're using an Android emulator there, but when you set components, does it use the default components of the device you're using? So Apple icons, Android icons, or is it using whatever kind of icons you're using from your packages?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There we go, I can click. So we are using a material app here. And by default, because it's Google and Google's also Android, they create a material app, but they do give you access to Cupertino stuff, so you can create it. I've always preferred the way material apps look, so I've only ever used the material side of things. But there is a platform service that you can solve, and you can say platform.is iOS or is Android, and that will return you a Boolean. And based on that, you could then, render either iOS components or Android components or whatever you want to do there.
Okay, nice.
Cool. Okay, cool. So now we're able to click between these. So that's good. So it looks like I can click. Okay, so now let's I want to change the color of this button based on this tab bar here. Let's get rid of literally any colors: pink, purple, blue. Okay, so now when we click this, you might just need to reload it. Okay, so when we click that, it should then say purple, and that's just the index, right? Okay, so now this floating action button over here, background color we want it to be, we want to use some state here. So we're going to have a variable called underscore color. And we need it to be, I think it's material color. And we can default it to colors.pink. Okay, let's actually make that blue, and let's see if that if that's working as we intended then. So counter's not being used right now. We can get, okay, cool. So we can see that that's defaulting to blue when it should actually be defaulting to pink, because that's what we said in the app theme. I was just making sure that works. So let's put that at pink, and then let's have a method called void set fab color. And okay, so this is only, so this on selection updated, right? It's only the callback is only giving us the index of the option that was chosen. Okay, so we're gonna have to do a switch case here. So we can say that the setFab color method is going to take in an int, which is the index, and then we can do a switch. Switch is the thing I get wrong the most in any language. So we can say if it is 0, return a set state. All right, this is, I should have accessed the set state here. Why do I not have access to such a film? So, okay, that's weird. And then we can set color to colors.pink, because pink is what we had, it's pink is first. For interest sake, if we were to not say set state, right, and we just said colors equals colors.pink, nothing will happen, because set state triggers the build method, this method over here, to run again, and that's where it then compares your new state with your previous state. So yeah, if you have a stateful widget, you need to use set state in order to actually manipulate that state. There are a lot of packages, and we'll go through that in later workshops on Flutter, where there's like something called a provider package, which is basically a state management approach, which allows you to not have to use set state everywhere. But if you're just writing a simple application like this, set state is the way to go. Okay, cool. So that's that case. And then we can have a case for 1, and we can have a case with defaults, and just return from that. Case of 2 and 1, and we said purple and blue. Okay, still moving nicely. And over here, we need to call set fab color, and we pass it in the index. There you go. So you can see how as we're creating this, it's actually changing the corresponding color there. So I guess we can make the counter work as well, because we changed that. So our counter body is a stateless widget, but it needs access to the value of the counter that is sitting in its parent, right? Because this this widget is the underscore my homepage state, which is a state object, is the parent to this counter body. So it actually needs to pass in the current value of this counter over here. So we can do that by, if we go to the counter body, we can say we have a final, remember, because it doesn't change for the existence and the lifespan of this particular widget. Okay, so we can say final int counter, and then we can have a constructor, hey, object-oriented programming, a constructor where we say this dot counter. Okay, and on our counter body, we can put a, actually, I think we can put a required tag over here. And then we can see the counter body over here is complaining because it says count is required and we haven't given it anything. So then if we say, cool, this is the value you must give that. And we say underscore counter. So that should then, if we redo this, that should initialize counter to 0. Well, there's a typo somewhere. Counter dot toString, because that is currently an int. And if we reload that, cool, that's refreshed. And now if we click this, there we go. We can see how that's incrementing there. So again, what's happening there is that our counter value for that state is sitting up here, which is the parent, and the parent is then actually passing that value down to the child. Okay. But now, let's say this toggle bar, right? I want to go one step further where you actually pass a function down, and that function is referencing the parent, which is setting the state. So if we take out this toggle bar stuff over here, and we create another class called, this is called my toggle bar. I'm not being creative today. And this will now be a stateless widget because it is just receiving the state. It is not trying to manipulate that state, right? And then let's override the build again. So this is something you type a lot in Flutter. And we're going to return toggle bar. Okay. Now, because we're in a different class, we don't have access to this method anymore, right? This method is sitting on the parent over here. So now we need to say that, hey, we actually need that function. So we can say final function. So this class is going to receive a function. And we can say handle color change, or we could call it set fab color. Remember, it's a function name, it doesn't matter. And then create a constructor. And we can say that, and then we send it the index. And then up here, let's just say it's required. So we just get the little notification saying you haven't passed this through. And over here, we say my toggle bar. And then we can see the autocomplete's automatically detected that that's what is required. So it autofills that for us. And then we can say set fab color. But we're not passing in parentheses or anything, an index, right? Because that would actually be invoking that method. We're just passing in that method itself. Okay. So now if we click this, again, working perfectly, we can see how we're clicking these buttons and it's swapping between different colors. And as we actually click this, it's incrementing that. And if we wanted to, you know, we could make another fab which would decrement it or something like that. So yeah, that kind of shows you the difference between stateless and stateful, and what you need to build a stateful widget in terms of creating the state object, which the element tree is then in charge of and controls, and it passes the state between each render. You can kind of see how to structure and go about changing the view and stuff like that. Obviously, there are a ton of different Flutter widgets, like center, like all of these different things, and that's what just comes with time and thinking, oh, I need to have this whole page be red. How do I go about that, right? So that's the biggest learning curve. But otherwise, it's very similar because just like in React, you know, you can pass functions down to children, and you can pass state down and all that type of thing. So it's kind of figuring out the same old problem we have in React in terms of prop drilling and passing down states and like what's the best approach, how many levels down should it go. But this is a simple example and we're keeping it light today. Yeah, any questions about anything that we just covered there? Does that kind of make sense, how we have a column over here that has 2 widgets, and those widgets are then our toggle bar, which is now stateless, and our counter body, which is stateless, and all the state manipulation is actually being handled within the state object. Any questions?
I sort of just have more of a comment around one of the last things you showed there, Harley. That was the passing of the function down into a lower order widget. it's very similar to JavaScript, right? So that's like a function delegate. You just basically, it's very JavaScript. Like if I look at that,
Yeah.
it reads JavaScript. Yeah. I don't know if it's obviously intended to allow for that easy transition from a React dev to a Flutter dev.
Yeah, they were very intentional with their approach in terms of, if you're Google and you now have the next like hot framework on the block, when React Native and Ionic are doing their job and they're doing it quite well, but the overhead to learn your framework is just too much, like you're not going to get the interest. And I think that's why it's done so well, because it's quite easy to get the hang of it. And the fact that your widgets themselves are handling the styling in terms of like saying background color, red, but also then like the functionality of a button where you can set here we're setting the color, but we're also saying when you press, do this. It's very similar to React in that process. So I think it's quite easy for React developers to pick up Flutter and quite quickly make a dent.
Very cool. And obviously the upside is that it's as close to native as you're going to get without being a native developer, right? So it gets rid of that JavaScript bridge and all of the latency involved there, and the arguments around it being non-native are moot, really.
Yeah, it's very tough to argue Flutter in comparison to native, which is another reason why it's doing so well.
Super performant, apparently.
Yeah, I've stress tested the applications I have built, and they don't break. And another bonus is that Flutter very, very well handles different screen sizes and different operating systems and all that type of stuff. I've had a lot of time spent working in Ionic and in React Native trying to handle the 6.9-inch phones and the 4.4 like iOS, like Apple iPhone 5 or 6 or something, right? Flutter, I've never had to worry about that. It handles it so well. It scales things really well, but also it gives you a lot of control in terms of how you want to scale things, that you can very easily access the height and width of the phone and then accordingly set sizes while maintaining like a min size or max size, in case someone's using it on a tablet now and you don't want things to be blown out of proportion.
Yeah, it's like it's like media queries in CSS, right? It sort of just handles it under the covers.
Yeah, so it's really powerful.
That's cool. That's cool. It's almost like it feels like a rapid prototyping tool, right? But looking at it,
go to production. Yeah.
But yeah.
But yeah,
Nice.
if that's pretty much it. So the last things, if you guys want these slides, you can get them here. If you want to check out the repo for this, it's there, and that's my GitHub there, where all the other Flutter and React things are. We are going to go into state management, and I do have a repository that I did last year where I compared all of the different state management approaches. So if you start diving into Flutter, you'll come across scope model, the block pattern, provider, all of those type of things. There's a repo that explains that as well. But that's all stuff we will get to in the following workshops.